The Millionaire's twins in. A big city filled with shining towers and endless traffic, there lived a man named Mr. Richard Coleman. He was known as one of the richest men in the city. People called him the Golden Businessman because everything he touched seemed to turn into profit. His companies stretched across hotels, fashion, and real estate. Wherever he went, cameras followed him, and newspapers wrote about his expensive suits, his luxury cars, and his grand mansion on the hill. But behind all the gold, Richard Coleman carried a sorrow no one could see. It was a sorrow that all his money, power, and influence could not wash away. That sorrow lived inside his house, inside the nursery room where his beloved twins, Ethan and Emily, had been born. The day the twins came into the world should have been his happiest. He had waited for years to become a father. His late wife, Catherine, had struggled for a long time before finally giving birth to them. Everyone celebrated their arrival. The mansion was decorated with flowers, music filled the halls, and guests congratulated him for having not one, but two beautiful children. Yet as months passed, something began to worry Catherine. The babies did not react to light. When she shook colorful toys in front of their eyes, they only turned their heads when they heard the sound but never followed the bright colors. When she opened the curtains to let the morning sun pour in, their eyes stayed blank, lost in shadows. Doctors were called. Tests were done. Finally, the truth came down like a storm on the family. Ethan and Emily had been born blind. Their eyes could not see the world around them. Richard had never felt such defeat. He had built empires, crushed competition, and won battles in boardrooms. But here in his own home he stood helpless. His wife cried for days and he tried to hold her, though inside he was breaking too. He promised Catherine that they would find the best doctors, the most advanced treatments, maybe even miracles. But as time went on, even the most skilled specialists shook their heads. It cannot be cured, they said. When Catherine passed away suddenly a few years later, Richard's world grew even darker. Now he was left alone with his twins, who needed him more than anyone. Yet he could not give them what they truly wanted, the ability to see. Inside the mansion, life became quiet and heavy. The twins grew, their world shaped only by sound, touch, and smell. They listened carefully to the footsteps of the maids, the rustle of leaves in the garden, and the humming of the fountain outside. They learned to laugh at stories and sing along with lullabies, but their eyes remained empty windows searching for light they could not find. For Richard, every smile of his children was both a joy and a knife to his heart. He loved them fiercely, but he also felt guilty. He often asked himself, why them? Why not me? Why did fate choose my children to live in darkness? No amount of wealth could buy the answer. The mansion staff treated the children kindly, but most of them did so out of duty, not love. Nannies came and left. Teachers were hired but did not stay long. Some were kind but distant. Others became frustrated with the special care Ethan and Emily required. To them, the twins were not just children, they were a burden, but the twins, innocent and pure, never complained. Ethan, the more talkative one, often said, "Daddy, I don't need to see. I can hear your voice. That is enough." Emily, gentle and quiet, loved to place her small hands on her father's face, as if to memorize every line and every feature she could not see. Still, Richard longed for them to see the sunsets that painted the sky over their mansion, the golden chandeliers that sparkled in their halls, and the faces of people who loved them. He longed for them to see the world he had built, the empire that one day would belong to them. He had everything, yachts, mansions, private jets, but every night when he sat beside their beds, he whispered silent prayers. He would have given it all away, every coin, every company, every luxury, just for one miracle, to see his children open their eyes and recognize his face. But the miracle never came. The world outside praised him for his success. But inside the walls of the Coleman mansion, he felt like the poorest man alive. The twins, however, grew up with laughter, curiosity, and resilience. They did not see themselves as broken. They loved stories, they loved music, and they loved the sound of their father's deep voice when he read them fairy tales at night. To them, their blindness was simply a part of who they were. They did not ask for pity. They only asked for love. And though Richard loved them deeply, he did not yet know that life was preparing to bring someone into their home, someone who would change everything he thought he knew about healing, miracles, and love. that someone would not be a famous doctor, nor a billionaire friend, nor a scientist with a breakthrough. She would arrive in the simplest form, a maid. A black woman with a heart full of warmth and wisdom. She would come quietly into the Coleman mansion, carrying no wealth, no power, no grand reputation, and yet she would bring the light his twins had been waiting for. The arrival of the new maid. The Coleman mansion stood like a palace on the edge of the city, its white marble walls shining in the sun. Yet inside, silence often hung like a heavy curtain. The children's laughter was rare, and their father's voice, though loving, carried sadness. The staff moved carefully through the halls, following strict rules, but very few of them offered warmth or comfort. It was on a rainy afternoon that she arrived. Her name was Grace Williams. She was a black woman in her late 30s, tall and graceful, with gentle eyes that carried both sorrow and strength. She had lived a life far different from the luxury of the Colemans. She came from a neighborhood where people worked hard just to survive, where mothers carried both jobs and children on their backs, and where kindness was often the only treasure a person could give. Grace had not planned to work in such a grand house. She had been recommended by a friend who had once worked as a cook there. At first she hesitated. "That house belongs to millionaires," she had said. "They don't need people like me." But when the offer came, she accepted. She needed the income, but more than that, she carried a quiet mission inside her heart, to care for children, no matter whose they were. When she stepped into the mansion, she was struck by the beauty of it. Chandeliers dripping with crystals, floors so polished they looked like mirrors, and rooms filled with priceless art. Yet, behind the beauty, she sensed a hollowness. She had walked into many homes before, and she knew the difference between a house and a home. This was a house, not a home. Her first meeting with Mr. Coleman was brief. He was polite but distant, his eyes tired from years of sorrow. "Your duties will be simple," he said. "Look after the children's rooms, their meals, their daily needs. But remember, they are special. They cannot see." Grace nodded quietly. She had cared for children before, some poor, some sick, some abandoned. But she had never cared for children born into such wealth, yet carrying such deep struggles. Her first encounter with Ethan and Emily was gentle and unexpected. She found them sitting in the nursery, holding hands, listening to the sound of rain tapping on the windows. Ethan was humming a tune while Emily traced her fingers along the edges of a toy piano. Grace did not rush to introduce herself. Instead, she stood for a moment, simply listening. Then she walked in softly and said, "That's a beautiful song, Ethan." The boy turned his head toward her voice, surprise flickering across his face. How do you know my name?" he asked. Grace smiled. "Because your father told me, and I'm here to help him take care of you." Emily tilted her head, her small fingers still resting on the piano keys. "Are you another nanny?" she asked, her voice carrying both hope and weariness. Grace knelt beside her. "Not just a nanny. Think of me as a friend." From that moment, something quiet but powerful began to grow between them. Grace did not treat them with pity as so many others had. She spoke to them with respect, laughed with them as if they were her own, and gave them space to explore the world in their own way. Unlike the other maids, she did not simply place food in front of them and walk away. She guided their hands to feel the texture of fruit, taught them to recognize spices by smell, and even encouraged them to cook simple things alongside her. "Your hands can see better than your eyes," she would say. Ethan loved to ask questions. "What color is the rain?" he asked one evening. Grace thought for a moment, then answered, "The rain has no color, but when it falls, it makes everything shine. Close your eyes and listen. Can you hear how it dances on the roof?" Emily, on the other hand, was quieter but deeply curious. She loved touching Grace's face the way she often touched her father's. "You smile a lot," Emily whispered one day. Grace laughed. "And do you know why?" "Why?" Emily asked. "Because smiles are gifts that cost nothing, and I have many to give." Slowly, the children began to bloom in her presence. They laughed more, asked more questions, and showed more courage in exploring their world. Where other nannies saw blindness as a cage, Grace saw it as a different kind of journey. She believed they could live fully, even without sight, if only someone believed in them. The mansion staff noticed the change, too. The twins no longer stayed locked in their room all day. They followed Grace into the kitchen, into the garden, and even into the library. where she read stories in voices so alive that the children felt the characters breathing beside them. Mr. Coleman watched from a distance. At first, he dismissed it as a passing phase. The children get attached easily, he told himself. This will fade just as it always does. But deep inside, he could not deny that something was different this time. Grace was not just doing her job. She was bringing life back into the mansion. And though he would not admit it yet, Richard Coleman began to feel something he had not felt in years. Hope. What he did not know was that Grace carried a secret. A wisdom passed down from her grandmother, who had been known in her community as a healer. Grace had grown up learning about natural remedies, meditation, and the deep power of human connection. She did not call it magic, nor did she claim it as science. To her, it was simply love given shape. And in the days to come, that love would begin to do what no doctor, no wealth, and no power had been able to do: awaken the light inside Ethan and Emily's world. A different kind of care the mansion had seen many caretakers pass through its doors. Some stayed for weeks, others for months, but none had truly touched the hearts of Ethan and Emily. They were kind children, but their blindness frightened many adults. Some teachers grew impatient, others simply performed their duty, then left. But Grace Williams was not like them. From the very first week, she began to care for the twins in ways no one had tried before. She did not see them as broken children in need of constant pity. Instead, she saw them as bright souls who had been given a different path. One morning, she found Ethan sitting by the window, his small fingers tracing the cold glass. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "I wonder what the sun looks like," he whispered. "Daddy says it is golden, but I don't know what golden means." Grace knelt beside him and placed a warm orange in his hand. "Golden feels like this," she said. "It is round, warm, and full of life. When you hold the sun, you feel safe. When you smell it, you feel happy." Ethan lifted the orange to his nose and smiled. For the first time, he felt that maybe he understood what golden meant. Emily, quiet and thoughtful, loved music more than anything. She often tapped on her little piano, making soft, broken tunes. Grace encouraged her. "Every sound is a color," she explained. "Close your eyes, oh, but you already do, and listen. The high notes are like bright colors. The low notes are like deep shadows. When you play, you are painting with sound." Emily's face lit up. "So, I can paint too?" "Yes," Grace said firmly. "You can paint with music, with touch, with words. You are not blind, Emily. You just see in another way." The twins were fascinated by her approach. She taught them to explore their world with all their senses. She took them to the garden and guided their hands across the petals of roses, across the rough bark of trees, across the cool surface of stones. "Every texture tells a story," she said. "You just have to listen with your hands." Soon the children could identify every flower in the garden by touch and smell alone. They laughed when they felt the soft petals of lilies, wrinkled their noses at strong marigolds, and clapped when they recognized lavender by its calming scent. But Grace's care went deeper than play. She believed in the strength of the human spirit. She taught the children small exercises of patience and focus. At night, she would sit with them, close her eyes, and say, "Imagine a light inside you. It may be small, but it is always there. Feel it grow brighter. That light belongs to you." The children followed her words with trust. Slowly, they began to notice changes. Ethan sometimes said he felt flashes, tiny sparks of brightness when the curtains opened in the morning. Emily whispered once, "I think I saw a shadow move." Doctors had told Mr. Coleman such things were impossible. But Grace smiled when the children spoke. "Never stop believing in the light," she would tell them. "Even a small candle can break the dark." The staff of the mansion could not ignore the change. The children, once quiet and reserved, were now full of curiosity. Their laughter echoed through the halls. They wanted to walk in the garden, help in the kitchen, even explore the library. Some servants shook their heads. "This maid fills them with silly ideas," they whispered. "She will only disappoint them." But the children did not care about whispers. They trusted Grace more than anyone. To them, she was not just a maid, she was a guide, a teacher, almost a second mother. One evening, Mr. Coleman came home late from a meeting. He was tired and burdened with thoughts of business. But as he entered the house, he paused. From the drawing room came the sound of music. Not the clumsy, broken tunes Emily usually played, but a soft melody full of life and rhythm. He walked closer and saw a sight that shook him. Emily sat at the piano, her fingers moving carefully while Ethan stood beside her, clapping along. And beside them was Grace, smiling, encouraging, guiding. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt his heart lift. His children were not merely surviving, they were living. That night, as he tucked them into bed, Ethan asked, "Daddy, do you think one day I'll see your face?" Richard froze, pain cutting through him. He wanted to say no to protect his son from disappointment. But then he remembered Grace's words to the children earlier that day. Never stop believing in the light. So he leaned down, kissed Ethan's forehead and whispered, "Yes, my son. One day you will." As he left the room, his eyes fell on Grace, standing quietly by the door. For a moment, their eyes met. He did not speak, but he gave her a small nod, a silent thank you. Grace understood. She did not need riches nor praise. She only needed to know the children were happier, stronger, and braver. That was enough. What no one realized yet was that her care was slowly planting seeds of change inside the twins, seeds that would grow into something far beyond anyone's imagination. Hope in the darkness. The Coleman mansion had always been quiet, its marble halls echoing with footsteps but rarely with joy. Yet now the stillness was broken by soft laughter and songs. Ethan and Emily, once withdrawn, were beginning to bloom like flowers long hidden from the sun. The change did not happen overnight. It grew slowly, like dawn rising after a long night, but it was undeniable. And at the center of it was Grace. Grace did not simply care for the twins, she lived for them. She gave them what no one else had ever offered: time, patience, and unwavering faith. She believed that even in the darkest places, hope could shine like a candle. One afternoon, she led them into the garden. The air smelled of wet soil, for it had rained earlier, and the roses were heavy with drops of water. Ethan clutched her hand while Emily trailed her fingers along the hedge. "Feel the rain still on the leaves," Grace said. She guided their small hands to the damp petals. "Every drop is a jewel the sky has given you." Ethan laughed, feeling the cool water on his fingertips. "So the sky gives presents?" "Yes," Grace smiled, "but only to those who know how to notice them." Emily tilted her head upward, her sightless eyes following the sound of birds. "I wish I could see the jewels." Grace knelt beside her. "Your eyes may not see them yet, child, but your soul does. And sometimes the soul sees more deeply than the eyes." The words touched Emily. She pressed her small hand against her chest, as if to guard the light inside her. That evening, something unusual happened. As Grace helped Ethan to his room, he suddenly stopped at the window. "Wait," he whispered. I think I see something." Grace's heart skipped. "What do you see, Ethan?" He pressed his face closer to the glass. "A shadow." "No, light. It's faint, but I can feel it in my eyes." Grace held back her tears. She did not want to frighten him with too much joy. "That's wonderful, Ethan," she said softly. "Hold on to it. Every spark of light is a promise." When Emily heard of it, she too grew determined. "If Ethan can see a little, maybe I can too," she said. The children's hope grew stronger, and with it so did Richard Coleman's curiosity. He began to watch more closely. He saw his twins smiling, heard their laughter, and noticed how they leaned on Grace with trust. At first he resisted believing anything could change. For years he had buried his dreams of their healing, but the evidence was before his eyes. Something was happening. One night after dinner, he found Grace in the kitchen washing the children's cups. He cleared his throat. "Tell me," he said, his voice low but firm. "What are you doing with them?" Grace looked at him calmly. "I'm teaching them to believe." Richard frowned. "Believe in what? Magic, fairy tales?" "No," she replied, setting the cup down. "To believe in themselves, in light. In hope." He shook his head. "Doctors said it was impossible. I've spent millions, consulted the best in the world. They all told me the same thing: there's no cure." Grace dried her hands and faced him directly. "And yet they never gave the children what they truly needed: love, patience, and faith." "Science is powerful, Mr. Coleman, but it is not everything. Sometimes healing begins where science ends." Richard had no answer. For years he had lived by logic, numbers, and facts. But now he was confronted with something he could not measure. He wanted to reject it, but deep inside he longed to believe. As weeks passed, more small miracles appeared. Ethan claimed he could tell when the curtains were open, because the light made his head feel warm. Emily said she could see a blur when someone passed in front of her. These were tiny steps, almost too small to notice, Yet for the twins, they were mountains. At night, Richard began to pray again, something he had not done since Catherine's death. He prayed not for wealth, not for business victories, but for his children's eyes to open fully one day. The staff in the mansion reacted in different ways. Some mocked Grace quietly. "She fills their heads with false hope," they whispered. Others, however, could not deny the joy she brought. Even the cold marble halls seemed warmer when the children's laughter echoed through them. One evening, Grace sat with the twins by the fireplace. She told them stories her grandmother used to tell, tales of stars guiding travelers, of rivers healing the weary, of faith moving mountains. The twins listened, their faces glowing in the firelight. "Do you really believe in miracles?" Ethan asked. Grace smiled gently. "I don't just believe, Ethan, I've seen them." "Then, do you think we'll have one?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Grace leaned closer and touched their hands. "You already are one," she said. "The world just hasn't seen it yet." At that moment, Richard stood quietly outside the room listening. He felt his throat tighten and his eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed in years. For the first time since his children were born, he dared to imagine a different future, not one of endless darkness, but one with a light waiting to break through. And deep inside him, something long buried stirred to life. Hope. The struggle against doubt. The Coleman mansion was slowly changing. Where silence once lived, the sound of children's laughter now floated through the halls. The twins were brighter, more curious, more alive. Grace had planted something powerful inside them. Hope. But hope, like a small flame, is fragile. And in the world outside the nursery, there were storms waiting to blow it out. Not everyone believed in Grace's ways. Some of the mansion staff shook their heads, whispering to each other when they thought she could not hear. "She fills their heads with lies," muttered one of the older maids. "Doctors said they'll never see. Why give them false dreams?" Another servant scoffed. "The man is rich. He can buy anything except sight. Does she really think her old stories and herbs can do what millions of dollars could not?" Even some of the tutors frowned at her influence. One of them, a strict teacher hired to teach the twins Braille and music theory, confronted Grace one afternoon. "You must stop telling them they will see again," he said sharply. "It will only break their hearts. They need discipline, not fairy tales." Grace listened calmly, her face unshaken. "Children need hope as much as they need food," she replied softly. "Without hope, their hearts will starve." The tutor sighed, shaking his head. "You'll only make them suffer more." But Grace was not easily shaken. She had seen too many children in her life, poor, sick, abandoned, who survived only because someone had given them hope. She knew it was dangerous to let despair win. Still, the pressure was heavy. Even Mr. Coleman, though secretly moved by the children's progress, carried his doubts. One night, after a long business meeting, he sat alone in his study, staring at the fire. Grace came to bring him tea. He looked at her with tired eyes and asked, "Do you really believe they will see again?" Her answer was firm. "I believe nothing is impossible when love is stronger than fear." He sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead. "You speak like my late wife." Catherine believed the same, even when the doctors told us to give up. I wanted to believe her, but in the end, she died believing in a miracle that never came. His voice broke slightly. "And I don't want my children to face the same disappointment." Grace set the cup gently on his desk. "Mr. Coleman, you are afraid of hope because you think it will betray you. But hope does not betray, it strengthens. Even if their eyes never open, hope will give them courage to live fully." Richard looked at her silently. He had built his empire on facts and strategies. Faith and love were things he could not measure. Yet when he saw his children smiling again, he knew there was truth in her words. Meanwhile, the twins themselves were caught in the middle of this quiet battle. Ethan was determined. "Grace says I can see shadows because my eyes are trying to wake up," he told his father one evening. "I know one day I'll see you, Daddy." Emily, however, wavered. Some days she was full of joy, playing her piano as if she could see the colors in every note. Other days she curled into Grace's arms and whispered, "What if they're right? What if I never see anything?" On those nights, Grace would hold her tightly and say, "Emily, your eyes may not open yet, but your heart is already wide open. You see more than anyone else." The little girl would cling to her words, though doubt still haunted her. As weeks turned into months, the struggle grew heavier. A family doctor visited to examine the children. After tests, he shook his head. Their condition is unchanged, he told Richard bluntly. These small flashes they describe are most likely imagination. I'm afraid there is no medical explanation for improvement. Richard's heart sank, though he did not show it in front of his children. The doctor's words were a sharp reminder of reality. That evening he argued with Grace in private. You heard him, Richard said. There's no cure. The children's progress is only in their minds. We should focus on helping them live with blindness, not feed them impossible dreams. Grace stood firm. And you heard your children. They feel something new. Even if the doctors cannot explain it, their experiences are real. You cannot ignore the light they sense. Light? Richard snapped. Or fantasy. Grace did not flinch. A father should not be the one to take hope away from his children. His words died on his lips. For a long moment the room was silent except for the crackling fire. Finally Richard turned away, torn between fear and faith. The twins, though unaware of the arguments, could feel the tension. They clung even harder to Grace, who remained their anchor in the storm. But one evening something happened that shifted the tide again. Emily was sitting in the library with Grace, running her hands over a book. Suddenly she gasped, Grace, I think I saw something. A flicker. It was like light moving. Grace's heart leaped, but she stayed calm. Tell me, child, what did you feel? Emily closed her eyes tightly, as if holding the memory. It was small, like a candle in the dark. But it was there. Grace hugged her tightly. Yes, Emily, hold on to that candle. One day it will grow. When Richard heard, he wanted to believe, but fear chained his heart. He stood by the door, watching his daughter's glowing face, and whispered to himself, what if it's only her imagination? What if we are all fooling ourselves? The struggle between doubt and hope raged inside him. But while he wrestled with fear, his children were already choosing faith, and Grace, steady and unshaken, would not let the flame of hope die, no matter how strong the winds of doubt became. The turning point. The struggle between hope and doubt had carried on for months in the Coleman mansion. Richard Coleman still lived with fear, torn between what the doctors told him and what Grace kept planting in his children's hearts. Grace continued her patient care, teaching Ethan and Emily to explore the world with touch, sound, and imagination. And though the whispers of servants and the judgments of tutors tried to crush the children's hope, a quiet strength was rising inside them. It was a Saturday morning when the unexpected happened. The day began as usual, with sunlight pouring through the high windows. Ethan was playing with wooden blocks on the carpet, while Emily sat by the piano, her small fingers gently pressing keys to form little melodies. Grace moved around them, humming softly, her presence as steady as the rhythm of a heartbeat. Suddenly, Ethan froze. He tilted his head toward the window, his hands still on the blocks. Grace, he whispered, his voice trembling, I see something again. Grace hurried to his side, kneeling beside him. What do you see, child? Ethan blinked rapidly, his pale eyes struggling to focus. The window. It's brighter. I can feel the light on my face, but this time I see it too. He pointed toward the window with a shaking hand. It's glowing, Grace's breath caught. She touched his shoulder gently. Describe it to me. It's white, Ethan said slowly, his voice uncertain but filled with wonder. Like a shining wall. Emily's hands left the piano keys. She turned toward her brother, her face full of hope. Ethan, really? Tears filled Ethan's eyes. Yes, Emmy, I think I really see it. Grace hugged him tightly, whispering, That's the light, my boy. Don't be afraid. Let it in. But before she could say more, Emily gasped. Grace, me too. I see something. She pressed her hands to her eyes. It's like shadows moving. Not clear, but I saw it when Ethan stood up. Grace pulled her close, her heart overflowing. Oh, my sweet Emily, you both are opening your eyes to the world. Slowly, but surely, the twins clung to her, trembling with excitement. Their laughter filled the room, bright and unstoppable. For the first time in their young lives, both had glimpsed the world through sight, even if only in flashes. Unbeknownst to them, Richard had been standing in the doorway, drawn by their voices. He heard every word. His heart pounded, torn between disbelief and awe. For years, doctors had said it was impossible. But here were his children, describing light, describing shadows. He stepped into the room, his face pale. Ethan, he said softly, his voice breaking. Emily, tell me again. What did you see? The children turned toward his voice. Ethan lifted his face proudly. Daddy, I saw the window glowing. Just like you said the sun does, Emily added, and I saw Ethan move. It was quick, but I know I did. Richard's eyes blurred with tears. He knelt before them, taking their small hands into his trembling ones. For a long moment, he could not speak. Finally, he whispered, My children, my beautiful children. Grace watched quietly, her own eyes wet. She did not interrupt. She knew this moment belonged to them. That evening, Richard called for the family doctor again. The doctor ran his usual tests, shining lights into the children's eyes, asking questions, recording their answers. His face grew more and more troubled. This is unexpected, the doctor admitted finally. If they are truly perceiving light and movement, it means their optic nerves may not be fully deadened. But I cannot explain how this progress happened. It goes against what we believed about their condition. Richard looked at him sharply. So you're saying there's hope? The doctor hesitated. There may be, but I cannot promise anything. Their vision is still very limited. It could fade again, or it could grow stronger. Time will tell. Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. For years he had trusted experts, and for years they had given him nothing but despair. And now, without medicine, without surgery, his children had taken their first step into light, with Grace by their side. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Richard found Grace in the kitchen. She was sitting quietly, sipping tea as though nothing extraordinary had happened. How did you do it? He asked, his voice raw. Grace looked up at him calmly. I didn't do it alone. The children believed. That belief opened a door. My job was only to guide them. Richard shook his head, overwhelmed. You gave them more than guidance. You gave them a miracle. Grace's voice was steady. Miracles don't always come with thunder and lightning. Mr. Coleman, sometimes they come like seeds, growing slowly in the dark until one day they break through the soil and bloom. He stared at her for a long moment. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless in the best way. Money had not done this. Power had not done this. A woman with no wealth, no fame, no science had done what he could not. She had given his children light. From that day forward, the mansion changed forever. The children's progress brought a new energy to the household. The staff, once doubtful, began to soften. Their whispers of criticism turned into whispers of amazement. The twins themselves glowed with joy. Every morning they rushed to the window to see if the light would return. Some days it was faint, some days stronger, but no matter what, they believed. For Richard, the turning point was not just in his children's eyes, but in his own heart. He finally began to see too, not with his eyes, but with his soul, and deep within, he knew this was only the beginning. Recognition and respect, the Coleman mansion, once heavy with sorrow, was no longer the same. Every corner now carried the sound of hope. The children's faint visions, light, shadows, colors, had awakened not just their eyes, but the entire house. Servants who had once whispered doubts now found themselves smiling when they saw Ethan and Emily, running their hands along the walls, laughing whenever they caught a glimpse of something new. Grace had become the heart of the home. She moved through the mansion not as a servant, but as someone who belonged. The children clung to her words, and Richard Coleman, though still a man of pride, could no longer ignore the truth. This woman had given his children what wealth and science never could. One afternoon, Richard decided to host a small family gathering. His relatives had not visited in years, most of them secretly judging him for keeping his children hidden away. They thought the Coleman twins were burdens, unable to live normal lives. Richard, once too ashamed to prove them wrong, now wanted them to see the change. The great dining hall was polished until it shone, and long tables were set with silverware. Guests arrived in luxury cars, their voices filling the mansion with chatter. They expected the same story they had always heard: blind children, a grieving father, and a life of quiet sadness. But what they found was very different. Ethan and Emily entered the hall with Grace by their side. Their faces glowed with joy, and their small hands waved shyly in the direction of the guests. There are so many voices, Ethan whispered to Grace. It feels like the room is full of stars. Grace squeezed his hand gently. Then shine like one, my boy. Emily clutched her little piano book, determined to show what she had been learning. The relatives looked on, some with forced smiles, others with curiosity. But the moment Emily sat at the piano and began to play, the room grew silent. Her fingers danced on the keys, not with perfect skill but with passion that filled every note. The melody rose gently like a sunrise breaking over the hills. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Emily blushed, hiding her face in Grace's arm. Ethan stood proudly beside her. "She can play colors," he announced loudly. "I can't see them yet, but I know they're there." A hush fell. The relatives looked at one another, confused. Colors? Play them? What did the boy mean? Richard rose from his seat, his face glowing with pride. "My children are not helpless," he said firmly. "They are learning to see, slowly but surely. And this woman," he gestured toward Grace, "is the reason why." The guests turned their eyes to Grace. Some were surprised, some skeptical. But no one could deny the evidence before them. The twins were not the same withdrawn children they remembered. They were alive, hopeful, and strong. After the guests left, Richard found himself walking out into the garden with Grace. The air smelled of roses, and the evening sun cast long golden rays across the grass. For a long moment he said nothing. Then at last he spoke. "I owe you more than words," he said quietly. "You have given my children something I thought was lost forever." Grace shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Coleman, I only gave them a hand to hold. The strength was always inside them." Richard's voice softened, almost breaking. "I spent years building a world of stone and gold. But you built something greater in just months. You built faith." For the first time he looked at her not as a maid but as a teacher, a healer, and perhaps even a savior. Respect filled his eyes. The children, too, gave her the highest recognition. One night, after Grace tucked them into bed, Ethan whispered, "Grace, can I call you Mama? Not to replace my real mama, but because you feel like one." Emily chimed in softly, "Yes, you're like the mama who makes the dark less scary." Grace's heart swelled with emotion. She kissed their foreheads tenderly. "You may call me whatever your heart tells you, and I will always answer." From that day, the twins began calling her Mama Grace. The staff, once doubtful, now followed her lead. They began treating the children with more patience, more love. The cold mansion that once felt like a museum slowly transformed into a home filled with warmth. Even the chandeliers seemed to sparkle brighter, as though they too celebrated the change. But perhaps the greatest recognition came from Richard himself. At the next company event, reporters asked him about his success. For years he had boasted of profits and new ventures, but this time he spoke differently. "My greatest treasure is not in my business," he told them. "It is in my children, and their healing. I owe it to someone who taught us that love can do what money cannot." The newspapers the next day carried headlines not about deals or hotels, but about the Coleman twins, their journey, and the mysterious maid who had brought them light. Grace, however, did not seek fame. When asked for interviews, she simply said, "I am just a servant of love. The children are the miracle, not me." For Richard, that humility only deepened his respect. Recognition had come from every corner, family, staff, even the world outside. But the greatest respect of all was in the eyes of the twins, who looked at Grace as though she carried the sun itself. The mansion had once been a palace of sorrow. Now it was a place of healing, because one woman's faith had turned despair into light. Yet, as the days grew brighter, fate was still preparing the final chapter, and soon, the miracle that had begun in shadows would come to its full light. A new beginning. The Coleman mansion no longer felt like the same place it once was. Once filled with silence and sorrow, it now carried the sound of laughter, piano notes, and hopeful whispers. Ethan and Emily were no longer seen as fragile children hidden in the dark. They were becoming the very light of the house. Grace Williams, the woman who had entered the mansion quietly as a maid, was now its heart. To Ethan and Emily, she was Mama Grace. To the staff, she was a guide. And to Richard Coleman, she was a miracle worker, though she never claimed that title for herself. The twins' eyesight was still limited, but it was undeniable. They were seeing more with each passing week. Ethan could now trace the outline of a window, follow a moving shadow, even recognize when someone waved a hand in front of him. Emily, though slower, had begun to describe colors, not perfectly, but enough to amaze anyone who listened. One evening, as the golden sunset filled the sky, Grace gathered the children in the garden. "Today I want you both to do something brave," she said. What is it? Ethan asked, gripping her hand tightly. Walk across the garden. Without holding me, Grace said gently. Trust your steps. Trust the light you feel. Emily hesitated, fear clouding her face. But what if we fall? Grace knelt between them, her voice soft yet firm. Then I will be here to catch you. But if you never take the step, you will never know how far you can go. The children looked at each other, then nodded. Ethan took Emily's hand. Slowly, carefully, they began to walk. Their feet brushed against the grass, their steps unsure but determined. The evening sun fell across their faces and Ethan gasped. Emily, I see the ground glowing. It's green. Emily blinked hard, her eyes straining. Then suddenly she cried out, I see it too. It's like the world is shining. Grace's heart swelled. She clapped her hands, tears rolling down her cheeks. Yes, my children, that is life showing itself to you. Richard had been watching from the terrace, frozen with awe. He covered his face with his hands, sobbing quietly. For years he had begged God for one miracle, and here it was. His children walking toward the light. That night, after the children went to bed, Richard found Grace in the kitchen, preparing tea. He stood silently for a long time before speaking. I used to think money could buy anything, he said quietly. But today I saw the truth. I saw my children walking into a new life because of you. Grace shook her head, her voice humble. It wasn't me, Mr. Coleman, it was them. They believed. They fought. I only gave them the courage to see with their hearts until their eyes could follow. Richard's voice trembled. Still, I cannot deny what you have done for this family. You came here as a maid, but you became our savior. Grace placed the teacup on the table and looked at him with calm eyes. I didn't come to be a savior. I came to love. Sometimes love is enough. Her words sank deep into his soul. For the first time in his life, Richard Coleman understood that true wealth was not in money or mansions. It was in love, kindness, and faith. The weeks turned into months, and the children's sight continued to improve. Doctors remained baffled. Some called it partial recovery, others called it unexplainable. But Grace, the twins, and Richard knew it was something greater, a miracle born of love and persistence. One Sunday morning, Richard took his children to the city park. Crowds turned their heads as they walked, for everyone had heard the story of the blind Coleman twins. But now, the children's eyes sparkled with life. Ethan pointed at the tall fountain. Daddy, I can see the water moving. Emily squealed. And I see the birds flying. Strangers stopped to watch, tears in their own eyes. The sight of two children stepping out of darkness into light touched every heart around them. Back at the mansion, Richard gathered the staff and spoke from his heart. For years I thought this house was cursed with sadness. But today it is blessed with the greatest gift, a new beginning. And I want everyone here to know that none of this would have happened without Grace Williams. The staff applauded, some wiping away tears. Grace stood quietly, her head bowed. She did not seek recognition, but in that moment she received it, not only from the mansion but from the lives she had touched. That evening, Ethan and Emily cuddled beside her on the sofa. Ethan whispered, Mama Grace, do you think one day we'll see your face clearly? Grace smiled, stroking his hair. Yes, my boy. One day you will. And until then, you don't need eyes to know my face. You already see me with your heart. Emily added softly, even if we see everything one day, we'll never forget who gave us the first light. Grace hugged them tightly, her heart full. The light was always yours, children. I only helped you find it. As the stars filled the night sky above the Coleman mansion, Richard stood by the window watching his children sleep peacefully. For the first time in years, he felt free from the chains of despair. His children had been blind, but now they were walking toward a new dawn. And he knew the truth. It was not money, not power, not doctors who had changed everything. It was the quiet love of one woman who entered their lives as a maid, but left as family. The Coleman twins had been born into darkness. But now, thanks to Grace, they were walking into the light. It was not just healing. It was a new beginning.